What's up, guys? This is Desm101. Welcome back for another episode of Gradius Lore, and thank you so much for all the comments and feedback on the previous episode. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the Salamander and LifeForce games and see how it's influenced the lore of Gradius, and just kind of dive into more of a deep, detailed look at this game and how it's influenced the rest of the series. So, let's get started. By 1986, Konami was eager to follow up Gradius with another shooting game on the same hardware, under a different title that utilized the Vic Viper, while adding many changes including two-player simultaneous play, and alternating between vertical and horizontal levels. This game is, of course, Salamander, a name that evokes the mythical fire elemental, which is also creatively represented in the animated logo. It's definitely not a direct sequel to Gradius, though it could be considered more like a sister series since they both contain many of the same elements. As you may know, there are a couple versions of this game bearing the name Life Force, which are mostly variations on this original. In the game, the second player takes control of a new ship, the Lord British, for the first time, a red equivalent of the Vic Viper. Salamander appears to be intended to expand upon some of the ideas that were introduced in Gradius, experimenting in different ways, which is not unlike how many other popular series can deviate from the original. Power-ups are now represented by symbols of mechanical appearance, similar to other early shooters, and they are announced to players as they appear on screen. Yes, the game, like many other Konami arcade games of that period, made frequent use of voice samples, reminiscent of old speech reading programs. The player no longer returns to a checkpoint upon death and can instead continue play immediately, with some invincibility frames. The bosses sport far more elaborate and eye-catching designs, and the stage themes add some memorable touches, such as the chaotic fire zone. It was regarded highly in the arcades for its variety and creative presentation, coupled with a high level of challenge. When it was localized for the US arcades that same year, they changed the title to Life Force and added an intro scroll that gives us a story about a warrior called Sentinel XR1, whom has a brain tumor that must be destroyed, requiring the player to fly into the being and travel through its body, fighting the attacking antibodies and mutations from within. This may sound similar to the plot of Fantastic Voyage or the later film Inner Space. Konami was pretty happy with this updated version of the game and decided to re-release it back in Japan, as Life Force this time, doubling down on the biological theme taking place inside a living being, with additional new changes to the graphics and sprites to emphasize the biological theme and even more voice samples that commented on the levels and bosses as you play. It also included different names for the power-up weapons to add to the confusion. The power-ups for this version are now back to the Gradius style with a meter at the bottom of the screen where you need to pick up capsules to allow you to select power-ups as you see fit. Here, we can also see the first example of giving a different loadout to the second player ship, with speed up being the last on the meter and missiles first, along with other differences such as having the ability to equip 3 shields at once. This makes an interesting distinction between the two crafts. Most people around my age are probably more familiar with Life Force on the NES, a big hit with a lot of NES fans when it came out in 1988 in the US, the previous year in Japan. There seems to be quite a number of people who don't really associate Life Force with Gradius due to the differences in the name. Since it includes Vic Viper and shares elements such as bosses and themes, it's definitely relevant to us. It's notable for having Vic Viper correctly named in the instruction manual, and it further cements elements that become recurrent throughout the series. So for us in the States, this was a vital piece of the puzzle to begin discovering the lore of the universe of the series. We will go into more detail with the NES game as well as the rest of the ports later in this episode. This time, planet Lattice, rather than Gradius, is the central planet of the story in Salamander. Lattice is located within the Metalian solar system, along with planet Gradius. According to canon, this story begins in the year 6709, taking place 46 years after James Burton was promoted to captain after his successful defeat of the Bacterians from the original Gradius story. From the NES manual, we see the super being Zelos is devouring planets, and it mentions planet Gradius was already taken, with Lattice next up on the path of destruction. Most of the deviations from the story in the NES manual are not considered canon, it should be stated. Lattice is invaded by the Bacterian army disguised as Lattice forces, making them vulnerable to the attack. The Bacterian cluster festering and growing upon Lattice is spreading throughout the planet and changing it into a dangerous holdout for the gathering Bacterian army. The NES manual refers to these as Terror Zones, which must be destroyed first before heading into Zelos' core to eliminate it entirely. The Prince of Lattice readies himself for battle to save his planet, and he pilots the ship called Lord British, named after himself and very likely a reference to the character created by Richard Garriott from the Ultima series. It's not clear exactly why they would choose this name, maybe due to growing popularity of RPG games in Japan at the time. The NES manual calls his ship the Road British, likely a translation error, but still sounds funny nonetheless. Lattice sends a distress signal call to their surrounding planets in the Metalian system, and Gradius responds by sending over the Vic Viper, though it's not entirely clear if Captain Burton is the pilot of Vic Viper for this mission. We know this version of the Vic Viper is BP-8332, which has slightly altered wings from the first one and also appeared in the sequel. With these ships comes the debut of the Ripple Laser, called the Pulse Laser in Life Force, a ring-type shot that grows larger in length as it travels across the screen. It's usually considered not as strong as the laser, but it's useful for clearing the screen from dense groups of enemies. I wanted to briefly mention Salamander also received a much expanded and changed version of the story on the MSX system. This version appears to be a real labor of love from the developers at Konami, since there are extensive introductions for both Japanese and Western releases of the game, which details the story, and they went to great lengths to hide secrets and further expand upon ideas in the series. We can credit this version for adding to the lore and likely generating far more interest in the backstory for fans of Gradius and Salamander. Here, it's essentially a new game bearing the same name. Notable story changes are the introduction of the Telsa Galaxy, where Lattice exists alongside new planets. The ships are replaced by the Thrasher and the Saber Tiger, piloted by Zoe Scott and Iggy Rock, respectively. Perhaps these are references to Iggy Pop and David Bowie? I'm not sure. We also see mention of Emperor Lars the 18th, and you probably know him better as James Burton. Since it is technically a different game, we will have to revisit the story of the MSX version for its own episode. We will be considering both of the arcade versions as well as the NES and Famicom ports, since these are probably the most well-known versions to my audience, and they are fairly consistent as far as shared similarities. Though, there are some differences that are important to point out when looking at the levels and bosses of these versions side by side. That puts us at the first level, Bionic Germ being the name, which is referred to as Cell Stage 1 in the NES manual. It has the iconic look of a living interior with giant gnashing fangs protruding from the cell walls. This stage is called Stomach Muscle Zone in the arcade Life Force. The boss, known as the Golem, a brain with arm-like tentacles and an eye that emerges from the front, which is vulnerable. This boss is likely quite familiar to anyone who has played the game and stands out as a significant design that made an impression on players at the time. It is suspected that Golem controls the Bionic Germ, since the Bionic Germ vanishes when he is defeated. Its name is likely derived from the Jewish folklore, which is a being said to have been created from mud or clay and brought to life through magic. The Golem shows up again in the boss rush of Gradius 2 and in the sequel Salamander 2, as well as Gradius Gaiden, and even a secret boss in Gradius 3. The second level is called Meteorite Space, where it switches to a top-down view and you have to dodge incoming meteors as well as deal with enemies. The meteors are indestructible. In the NES manual, it has been changed to the Volcano Zone, which evokes memories of the first stage of Gradius. This stage shows up later in the arcade version. The arcade Life Force calls it the Kidney Zone, and instead of meteors, you need to avoid kidney stones. The boss of level 2 is another staple of the series, Tetron, a big core type ship which has 4 rotating arms which surround the craft, making it tricky to maneuver around. In the Life Force arcade game, Tetron was renamed to Xylon and given an appearance that resembles the Golem from level 1. The NES game has Fortress Valis moved into this stage, the typical base type boss, which then leads to Cruiser Tetron when defeated. The Tetron boss shows up several more times, including Gradius 2 and 5, as well as even making a cameo in the Rocket Knight games and even in Yu-Gi-Oh! Level 3 is called Burning Chaos and is probably the most memorable level of the game, full of flares that erupt suddenly, causing many a cheap death and leaving players in awe. The NES manual calls it the Prominence, while the Life Force arcade has named it Stomach Inner Chamber. The boss of this level is the Intruder, a large fire dragon which is mentioned in Lattice Prophecy, and certainly the reference of a fire elemental in the title. The Intruder is another frequent boss of the series, highlighting what an important influence this game is to the lore. In the NES version, we only get to see the face of the Intruder, which looks quite impressive the first time you reach that point in the game. The flames of the Burning Chaos level are made blue in the Stomach Inner Chamber of the Life Force arcade game. Similarly, the color of the Intruder is blue here as well. The Intruder appears many times again, including Gradius 2 and even showing up in Castlevania. For Salamander, the fourth level is the Volcano Zone, while in the NES manual is called Cell Stage 2, and it has also been referred to as Organic Speed Zone. In the Life Force arcade, it is known as Liver Zone. That's a lot of different names. This is the same as the second level of the NES game. The NES Cell Stage 2, aka Organic Speed Zone, is unique to this version, having a similar appearance to the first stage, and including some sped up areas. It finishes up with an impressive looking rib cage where you must survive by dodging lasers and then meeting up with the skull-like boss Giga at the end. The Fortress Valis boss from the second level of Life Force shows up here in the Salamander game instead. Giga shows up in the Famicom version of Gradius 2, and the Fortress Valis is not seen again, although it's part of a category of bosses referred to as gun walls, which shows up in most of the games. The fifth level is Asteroid Hell in Salamander, another space stage where you need to dodge large asteroid objects. The NES takes another unique turn here and instead presents Temple Zone, which starts out like a standard cave level, but ends up with a wonderful Egyptian theme, complete with a boss represented by a floating King Tutankhamun visage, as seen in the famous golden mask from its discovery in the early 20th century. In Salamander, the big core-style ship known as Death makes its debut here, another impressive boss ship that has 2 forms. In Life Force Arcade, we get the wonderful creative Ga, a personal favorite design of mine. It functions similar to Death, but with a new grotesque biological alien appearance, and ability to release mini-enemies. Both Ga and Death show up again in games, but not the same can be said about King Tut. The final level is known as Fortress Zone. The NES manual calls it Mechanical City Stage, while Life Force Arcade calls it the Brain Area. In this level, you will encounter the original big core ships in the arcade only, and in giant Moai head statues from the first Gradius. They look a bit different here and can now jump around the screen a bit. They seem to guard the final boss. The final boss is the giant orb Zelos, whom you most likely recognize if you are familiar with the series. This red ball is sometimes considered an eyeball and may or may not attack the player depending on the game. It is said that Zelos Force can manipulate matter, control large forces of Bacterian armies, and even oversee an entire absorption of planet. Zelos appears numerous times, including the first level of Gradius 5. In 1996, Konami brought Salamander back into the arcades with a sequel that used the Konami GX Type 2 system, running a very colorful game with a mostly pre-rendered look to the graphics. Now you need to take down the invading Doom alien race instead of Bacterians. Vic Viper returns, and second player is now Super Cobra, likely a reference to a version of Scramble. It plays well and retains most of the elements of the series, but it wasn't as highly regarded in the arcades as the original. It didn't add much to the lore as of yet, but we may look at it in greater detail in a future episode. Let's go over the ports of Salamander. The Famicom version is called Salamander, even though it's pretty much the same as the NES Life Force. It does have a different ending depending on how many continues are used. If the player completes the game using no continues, we see a female pilot whose identity is unknown, and thus brings into question the fact of why James is not piloting the Vic Viper, and what his relation to this female pilot is. We already mentioned the MSX version, but it's worth noting that it introduced many new mechanics, such as being able to permanently upgrade your weapons by collecting E-capsules. It's considered very high on the level of difficulty, and even if you are familiar with the arcade or 8-bit versions, you'd be surprised just how vastly different it is. That is why it's really its own game, and not technically a port. The player can also insert a secondary cart into the MSX for additional content to be unlocked, including the true ending for the game when you insert Gradius 2. Aside from the original cart, you can play this on the Konami Antiques collection for PS1 or Saturn, or via emulation of course. Like I mentioned before, we will revisit this in a future episode, as well as the other Gradius MSX games, which is where the lore really seemed to flourish for the series. Salamander got an arcade perfect port on the X68000 computer, which is not a surprise since this computer was great at handling arcade ports. The PC Engine also got a port which is pretty close to the arcade with some changes to the gameplay, such as a checkpoint system being implemented upon death and vertical scrolling in the horizontal stages. There was also a port to the Commodore 64 by Imagine, which is fairly impressive, though it is missing a couple levels. Then finally there was a version for the Amstrad and ZX Spectrum published by Ocean. It's not very accurate to the original, but it still has some fans who may or may not remember it fondly. The Salamander series got two collections from Konami. One is the deluxe pack for Saturn and PS1, which has Salamander, Salamander 2, and the Japan version of Life Force Arcade. These compilations were never released in the West. Additionally, a Salamander portable collection was released for the PSP only in Japan. It includes Salamander, Salamander 2, Life Force, Japanese arcade version, and a unique version of Gradius 2, aka Nemesis 2, and Zexex, a mostly forgotten arcade shooter from Konami that has similarities to Gradius and Salamander. Before we wrap up, let's briefly look at the OVA anime of Salamander, which came out in 1988 and was a combined effort between Pony Canyon and Konami, taking place over 3 episodes. It's not considered canon, but many of the elements from the universe make an appearance, including the Salamander Dragon, Lord British, Moai Heads, Gopher, and lots more. The art and animation is pretty good, and it's an entertaining watch for any fans. You can watch it here on YouTube. I will include a link to my anime playlist that contains them in the description. I hope this episode gave you some insight into how Salamander and Life Force are connected to Gradius. While not a direct sequel, its importance to the lore of the series overall cannot be overstated. With the experimentation and unique ideas brought forth, we can trace how much this has impacted Gradius 2, which would become one of the most highly regarded entries in the entire series. Salamander also began its own lore with the MSX version, and even with the versions of Life Force that came after it, ever adding into the pool of ideas that ultimately enliven and enrich this fascinating world.